I would like to introduce our moderator, who's drinking from a NAHA cup. How appropriate. Annette Atkins is Professor Emerita of History at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. A teacher and scholar of Minnesota history, she's the author of Creating Minnesota, A History from the Inside Out, and many other publications. For 5 years, Annette was the on-air historian for Minnesota Public Radio. And currently, or you need to update, the book of the shoe history. Is it still current? Okay, currently, she's at work on a book that tells the American story by focusing on shoes. She's a past board member of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Stearns County Museum, and we're so fortunate to have her on our board right now. So, Annette, thank you.
I didn't intentionally wear an orange jacket to match the new logo, but I'm not unhappy that I did. So today is a day about stories, and I hope around your tables and over lunch and over coffee, you're telling each other your stories. There are so many good stories sort of packed formally into the day, and so many good stories packed inside each of you. So we want to highlight stories today. And partly as an historian, partly as a person, I know how important stories are in shaping us. One of my favorite writers, Rebecca Solnit, says, "We tell our stories and then our stories tell us." We tell our stories and then our stories tell us, which I think is wonderful. I'm going to give you a little personal example. My father's father had run away from home, run away from Arkadelphia, Arkansas. And the story that I knew about why he did that, and the story that I carried from the time I was 10 to the time I was 35, was that he ran away from home to become a Catholic. Well, it wasn't an accident that I ended up as a professional, as a teacher at a Catholic college. Man, I did it partly because of the sacrifice that my grandfather had made in order to become a Catholic. Well, a few years after I'm a tenured full professor at St. John's, one of the relatives goes back to Arkadelphia and says, he didn't run away to become a Catholic. He ran away because he was accused of a murder. Well, first I have to say, holy crap. I could have had such a more interesting life if I'd known that I was descended from a murderer. But it turns out, of course, to be way more prosaic than that, because another relative goes back a few years later and says, nah, it was a shotgun wedding. His girlfriend was pregnant. All right, so you can see how and he did end up Catholic. So what's interesting to me as an historian about that story is that there are pieces of truth in each of the stories. And now, 50 years later, 100 years later, I don't know the truth. I don't know which of those is quite right. I don't know where to lean, which takes me to my despair that there aren't archives that I can go to find out the answer to that question. So I'm not going to find out that truth, but the glory, the richness of archives is I can go to those archives and find out other truths about people like my great-grandfather or like my grandfather. Because when we tell our stories, we need, as historians, to tell a great story, to tell a compelling story, and to have evidence for that story. And what the archives can do is to give us the foundation on which we make decisions, foundations on which we know ourselves. And, I could have taken that job at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin, which I preferred over the St. John's job because it was right on the lake. Maybe I could have made a better decision if I had known more about my personal story. So the pleasure of the day today to me is that we get to celebrate story, we get to celebrate archives, and we get to start with a woman, herself an immigrant. Just such a powerful story that she carries in her person. So she's born in Italy. She ends up getting her PhD at the University of Kansas. That's a long jump. That's sort of like going from Stavanger to Sioux Falls, But the weather is, we'll see. We'll see what the weather. Her title is so long that I'm only going to give you half of it. And her biography is so rich, I'm only going to give you a tiny piece of it. So she's on the faculty of Gustavus Adolphus. She's a 20th century U.S. historian. And she's a professor in history, peace studies, gender, women, and sexuality studies. That's half the title. You can give us the other half when you come up. Her most recent research has been especially on immigration restriction, and her book, Unwanted, Italian and Jewish Mobilization Against Immigration Restriction, is so interesting, because I don't think of the Italians and the Jews in the same category. And the glory of this book is that it takes our categories and mushes them around, invites us to think about groups in different ways and people in different ways. She's also been the editor of 2 anthologies, one currently under contract. And the thing I most want to track down is when you guest edited the Journal of American History on the 1924 Immigration Act. So I guess I never even said your name, which is Maddalena Marinari, and she's talking today on that 1924 Immigration Act. Thank her for coming and welcome her.
Can you hear me? I would rather not hold it. Great. Good morning. I know I come from Gustavus, but I come in peace. I should have, right? This is such a beautiful campus. I've never been here before, so I'm really grateful that I was invited to be part of this. I also believe that this is the last time, hopefully for a while, that I get to talk about 1924. I think I've done 10 events because it's the centennial, right? It's not a fun story. But hopefully it's an interesting story. And before I get started, I really want to say that this book would not be possible without the help of so many archivists. One of the most memorable moments is when someone at the National Archives in DC was so desperate to help me and frustrated that he took me behind in the vault. It was amazing. And we literally start opening boxes to see if we could find something. And so you'll see some of the quotes that I have for you actually come from that research. So I don't think I would be here as a historian if archivists hadn't been so generous with me. So please remember that everything I'm going to say relies on the work of archivists today. All right. So one of the sponsors of the 1924 Immigration Act, Albert Johnson, when the act finally passes, says that it was America's second Declaration of Independence. That's a really big statement. And it actually happens in a fairly short amount of time. You go in 1875, where there are not a lot of restrictions, to 1924, when arguably the most restrictive and racist immigration law in U.S. history is passed. So I want to kind of tell you, how did we get there so quickly? And also what the role of Scandinavian immigrants and other Northern and Western Europeans was in that transformation. And so I'm going to kind of look at 3 things, essentially. One of the biggest things that happens, and that helps us understand why all of a sudden the United States start passing one restrictive law after another, is that there are new immigrants coming. So you'll see what they think about that and who those are. We're also going to look at what kind of restrictions does the United States pass once this new immigrant arrive. And then the last point is we get to see, well, what did the immigrants who were already in the United States do because there is a really remarkable, noticeable change in the rhetoric about immigration. We don't know anything about that today. All right, so traditionally, we kind of divide the phases of immigration to the United States in 3 moments. We have from 1840s to the 1860s, where mostly Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians arrived. So some of your ancestors might be dating back to those days. And it's not that they did not keep coming in the next phases, it's just that the numbers were disproportionately bigger, right? And then there is a shift between 1870s and 1920s where it's mostly Asians. At first they were Chinese, and then Japanese, and then from other parts of Asia. And then Eastern and Southern Europeans. So I start thinking, what's different about the first group and the second group? And then after 1965, really from immigrants are coming from all over the world. And even though Europe is listed there, it's really Asians, Latin Americans, and Africa. That kind of so it's a very marked shift, right? We could say that until 1965, we have an overwhelming number of Europeans coming, and after that, it kind of keeps its changes. As you can tell, there is a gap there, and it's intentional. Between 1920s and the 1965, it's the period when the 1924 Act is passed, is in force, because it was repealed in 1965. And that's the lowest number of people who come in. There's also this big thing called World War II, right, which makes it difficult for people to move. There's also another big event called the Great Depression, which makes it harder for people to move. But in general, the numbers are minuscule, and many of the people who come in that time period are temporary, and very few of them are from Europe. We won't have time to talk about this today, but there's also, this is the period, right, 1930s and 40s, where there's a lot going on in Europe. So Jewish refugees are not admitted intentionally to the United States, right? So 1924 had huge consequences. We won't talk about after 1924, but if you're interested, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, so what did immigration look like before 1875? There are a couple of things that you need to know. It was mostly unrestricted. So today, right, we think of passports and visas. Well, none of that actually existed before World War I, and you have to thank the Germans for that. And so when we say, you know, my ancestor came in legally, that's a little bit problematic because the standards, the way in which people were admitted were very different. There was no paperwork, there were no photos, right? So it's a comparison that really doesn't hold because you're really comparing apples to oranges. The other thing that's different, and then I'll go back to point one in a moment, is that the federal government, for really complicated reasons, really doesn't do anything until 1875 when it comes to immigration. And the Constitution, in fact, says that the only role that the federal government should have when it comes to immigration is actually naturalization. So it just needs to guarantee that people who come into the country need to have a process to become American citizens. But until 1875, there is a few laws about how that happens. A lot has to do with those Northern Europeans. So there's a huge debate, like, how long should these people be in the United States before they're allowed? So you go from 1 year to 15. And that proposal is there because Americans really did not like Irish and Germans and Scandinavians. But until 1875, right, there is a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. There is a lot of violence against immigrants. But none of the proposals become law. So I really need you to remind this, right? There's very strong anti-immigrant feelings. There's a lot of strong rhetoric. There is a lot of proposals, but none of it becomes law. So we need to understand what happens after 1875, where you go from ideas to practice, essentially, right? So because the federal government wasn't doing anything, a lot of the regulation was up to state. And you can guess which states, right? If you had immigrants coming in, you were probably doing something about it. So it's Pennsylvania, it's California, New York State, right? So wherever these immigrants are coming, and really there's only one category. So that's when people say, oh, there was a time in the US when everyone could come in, that's actually not true. There's always been one category of immigrants that the United States has always tried to not admit or deport, which is people with limited financial means. And that's where the cartoon comes from. And I should say that some of the cartoons, because of what I deal with, are a little bit problematic. I've tried to limit the number, but there's a couple that might be difficult to watch. And so, the 1875 Act, right, in very simple words, poor immigrants have never been able to arrive in the United States or stay. And that's true to this day as well. Up until 1875, right, there is still, and I'm using this word intentionally, tolerance for immigrants to try to preserve their heritage, right? Are Americans happy? Not particularly, but they can deal with it, right? And so, and even a little bit later, right? That's why you have places like Gustavus, as in Olive, right? Where there are immigrant colleges where people can try to preserve their heritage. All of this changes. So I'm going to warn you, this is one of the difficult cartoons. When the so-called new immigrants start arriving. So all of a sudden, Scandinavians, Germans, and Irish are becoming the old immigrants who went from unacceptable to not too bad. Maybe we wish we had more of those, right? And the new immigrants prevalently come from Asia, Eastern and Southern Europe. There are multiple things going on here, right? You can probably, I had a lot more cartoons, but they're just so much that I can look. So it's not just about culture, right? It's not just about the fact that they speak different languages. It's not just about that they come from different political systems. Italians and Jews have also different religions, as do a lot of Asians. So the anti-immigrant sentiments that you see after they start arriving is very different, right? The religious aspect is intensified, the cultural aspect, and then the racial components become much, much more pervasive, right? So these people start talking about unassimilable races, like they cannot possibly even have a chance to become American citizens. So, right, there's this one big shift. These new immigrants present remarkably different than everyone who's come before. But there's also a number issue. So these groups are also part of the largest migration in world history. The United States is not the only destination. I really want to make that. In fact, there are much larger number of people who are moving within Asia, for example. But despite the need that the United States has, because it's industrializing, right? Someone has to build those railroads. Someone has to work in those factories. So there is a real need. And in fact, at first, they're recruited by American recruiters because they're coming at a time when the United States is changing a lot, right? So that's the third component. It's who comes, the numbers, and when. The United States, right, just abolished slavery, so it has to figure out how to incorporate in the United States, into the country 4 million of formerly enslaved people. The United States has also started looking outward, right? It's moving west, but it's also moving towards the Caribbean and Asia, right? And so all of a sudden, it's like, how do these people belong into the American society, right? So it's also the period that they come that is particular, and that kind of lends itself to an even more intense rhetoric. And so by the end of the 19th century, you have a true national hysteria, in part because these immigrants go to different parts of the country, right? And so people start talking about hordes, invasion. But here is the thing that we kind of need to keep in mind, that from the very beginning, there's a very different approach to these two groups, right? So in 1882, there are the first two big federal immigration laws that are passed. One is targeting Chinese, and the other one is supposedly targeting Europeans, and they could not be any different. So the Chinese Exclusion Act does two things. It essentially excludes most Chinese immigrants, particularly those who are laborers, right? So unskilled, we would call today. If you're highly skilled and educated, you could still come in, but it's still really, really hard. And then, more importantly, if you're a Chinese immigrant who is in the country or somehow makes it to the United States, you cannot become an American citizen. And that will not change until 1943. It's a very long time, right? So that affects the Chinese community in very specific ways. There is barely, right? So the United States goes, no immigration laws, no immigration laws. We just deal with naturalization to bam, we're going to exclude an entire group of people based on race and prevent them from becoming American citizens. And then they say, what about everyone else? So they also passed the Immigration Act of 1882, which essentially makes those state laws about rejecting, right, people with limited financial means, the national law. It creates the Immigration Bureau. Yes, it takes until 1882 for the United States to get an Immigration Bureau. And it imposes a head tax because someone has to pay for the Immigration Bureau. So immigrants who come in have to pay a tax. So why the difference? So, right, Americans are comfortable excluding almost entirely. So at first, this is only supposed to last 10 years, and then it becomes permanent in 1902. It's renewed and then becomes permanent. But Americans have a hard time accepting the fact that they should restrict other white immigrants. And so you see yet another shift in rhetoric. This is the period of race science, eugenics, where they say, well, maybe there is a racial hierarchy, even among white immigrants. So I'm going to show you a couple of quotes to show you how the rhetoric changes even about European immigrants. Southern and Eastern Europeans are beaten men from beaten races, representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. And then a pastor says, the United States is in far greater danger from the quality of immigration that comes from Southern Europe than any peril that could come by Japanese ownership of lands in California or from Asiatic immigration. The closer you get to 1924, the more Southern and Eastern Europeans are compared to, so Italians, for example, were called the Chinese of Europe, and a lot of Jewish immigrants were often called Orientals, right? So there's an intentional effort to equate them to Chinese immigrants to say it's okay if we restrict them as well. Now, you're wondering, where are my people? So this actually poses a huge quandary, right? Because the rhetoric makes a really clear distinction between Southern and Eastern Europeans who are bad and Northern and Western Europeans who are acceptable. I'm not saying that, right? There's a big difference here. But a lot of Northern and Western Europeans understand that the line is really fine, where that rhetoric could go from just applying to certain Europeans to all Europeans. And so, right, they're worried about themselves too, let's be honest. And so at first, until World War I, they join forces essentially, which if you see, it's actually really hard to do, right? Because there's a rhetoric that divides these groups rather than unite them. And so between the 1880s and World War I, there's a lot of solidarities. There is a lot of letter drives. There is a lot of meetings, protests, strikes, right, saying you cannot possibly think about restricting these people who have helped the country become the country that it is, right? So just to give you a sense, thanks to immigration, in 1900, the United States is the most powerful country economically in the world. It produces more, 4 times more than the next 4 countries combined, which is France, Britain, 3 countries, sorry, and Japan, right? That was not the case in 1865 alone. And most of it is because of immigrant labor, right? And so at first, while they're not entirely comfortable with the new arrivals, they understand that there is a lot at stake for their own communities, right? Because their integration in American society could be affected by the rhetoric. And at a very practical level, whatever law gets passed, like the ad tax of 1882, affects people from everywhere, right? And so they elect certain people, they put pressure, they lobby essentially, even though lobbies didn't exist in the way we think about them today. So at first, right, they're very vocal and they're very visible in the fight against immigration restriction. You know where this is going probably by now. World War I kind of changes all of that. So there is a veritable hysteria during the war. Immigrants are attacked, particularly German immigrants. There are states like Iowa that pass laws that say that you cannot speak any other language than English. German newspapers go down. You cannot worship in another language, right? Because you have a target on your back by doing that, right? And so there's a lot of violence, intimidation, and a strong push to get rid of what people were. So this is the period where people were talking about the melting pot, right? So before World War I, there's still hope, right? That we can find as a society a way to come and be one and actually thrive from these different backgrounds. By World War I, that rhetoric has completely disappeared. And in fact, there is a explicit encouragement to abandon your hyphenated identity. So no longer, right, German American or Swedish American and so on and so forth. You're just American. There are citizenship drives, and then it goes into overdrive. It's like it's not just enough for you to abandon this identity and have to fully assimilate. You also have to be fully loyal, right? And there's no other way of showing your loyalty than becoming citizens, fighting for the United States, right? And just to give you one sense of how intense this rhetoric was, is that during World War I, the United States actually passes a lot of laws that target foreigners for potential treason, right? And right after World War I, there's thousands who are rounded up just because of the kind of ideas they have or where they come from, right? So you as a foreigner, you're automatically suspected of having questionable political ideas, right? And most of those laws are still in place today. So right, the rhetoric changes. The expectations of what it means to be an immigrant in the United States changes. And if you don't align, there are very practical consequences, right? But there is also in the middle of the war another major change. So historians debate which of these three is the most important. Some people argue that it's the last one. So one of the reasons why a lot of Americans continue to be reluctant to target European immigrants, and one of the reasons why Northern and Western Europeans could continue to speak out, was because the business community was behind European immigration. Well, the war changes that. And there are a couple of things. Well, three things. One, by World War I, a lot of these businesses need fewer people because they've introduced machines, right? And so now they can replace people with machines. So think Ford and what he was trying to do, right? Number two is that they realize that, it's actually really expensive to encourage and recruit people from Europe. We have a much more easily available resource of cheap labor, which is right across the border, right? And it's not that they necessarily like Mexicans. What they like about that is that they could be deported more easily when they are no longer needed, right? So it's not like, they're much harder workers. They're being very pragmatic. And so all of a sudden, right, a pillar of this anti-restriction movement that had a lot of sway with politicians pulls its support, right? So the shift is ideological, political, geopolitical because of the war, but there is also this economic change that makes a lot of people now think twice before they say anything really about immigration. And so what happens? The moment these three things align, you have the most restrictive immigration law to date, which is the 1917 Immigration Act. So it imposes, it extends Chinese restriction to a large chunk of Asia, but it also introduces the literacy test because people think that the literacy test is so everyone 14 and older has to demonstrate that they can read, essentially. And they think that because Southern and Eastern Europeans are ignorant, they will not pass, and it's the easiest way to get rid of them, right? As an aside, very quickly, why did they choose the literacy test? Because it had worked very, very effectively against African Americans in the South to prevent them from voting. So oftentimes, immigration history and African American history are kind of treated separately, but there's more overlap than we think, and this is really one way where they're drawing that connection between the two. But as harsh as and we'll talk about this in a moment. The other thing that 1917 does is that it makes really, really long the list of people who can come in, right? So it's the most comprehensive immigration law at the time, and it affects pretty much every immigrant, right? So Asian, European, and as you see, lots of other groups that overlap. And the law passes over President Wilson's veto. So Wilson doesn't think that this is a good idea, that we should actually still court immigrants, that immigrants are a critical component of American society. But Congress and pretty much everyone behind them say no. We need to become isolationists, which is America for Americans. That's what people were saying at the time. These shifts, of course, right, they affect what Western and Northern Europeans start doing, right? So Irish, Germans, and Scandinavians. And they become a lot quieter. They acknowledge, right, that 1917 is going to damage everyone, right, regardless where you're from in Europe. If you can't read, you can't read, right? But they are even more worried than they were at the end of the 19th century about what these laws are going to do to their own community. And so there's a new idea, right? And it has to do with that first point. Perhaps we need a compromise, right? As long as things don't get worse, we don't have worse restrictions, perhaps this is the compromise, right? We check the quality of immigrants, but we don't put quantitative, so numbers, we don't, right? And so there's a shift in support, but there is also a shift, and this happens among everyone, not just Western and Northern Europeans. Even the Italians I studied, the Jewish advocates, they all say the time where no restrictions are in place has passed. We have lost that battle. So what we can do is make sure that we don't have harsher restrictions. Because some of the ideas that percolate during World War I, it's like, forget about quality. We need to control how many people come into the country. But everyone is saying, including critics, it's like, no, the literacy test will work, we'll get better immigrants, everyone will be happy, and then we can move on, right? This is not how the story ends, of course. So up until 1921, right, the argument was we control immigration by controlling its quality. So let's focus on the quality of people, except for Chinese, right? They can't come in. But for Europeans, it's like, okay, so you can see, right? Some of this, actually all of them, most of them are still in place today. Don't want people who have limited financial means, right? So LPC means likely to become a public charge. This one is a trip because how do you determine who becomes a public charge? It's really vague, and it's intentionally so. And maybe you won't be surprised, maybe you will, if I tell you that the largest group of people to be excluded under that were actually women, especially women traveling alone, or even worse, traveling with kids but without a partner. So if you want to see a, kind of an immediate impact of immigration restriction on Scandinavian immigrants, that's right there. One of them, because Scandinavian immigrants are one of the few groups, along with the Irish, where you had women traveling alone, right? Those are family decisions, but it was the only group that, two of the groups that were comfortable sending women. All of a sudden, right, that restriction alone affects enormously immigrants from Northern Europe and Western Europe. We have race and nationality, right? So again, it's about quality, right? And really people talked about race in terms of quality, right? It's not the kind of immigrants the United States needs. And here, I kind of, in case it's not clear, the fear is that these people will have children, right? And they will have children that will change the composition of American society, and the American race will be diluted and end. Then the next one, this is where I spend a lot of time with my students, because ability was another one of those super squishy categories, because the language was really vague. So what does it mean, for example, when it comes to morality, moral turpitude? I have students look it up because it's like, we don't know what it is. So it was a fancy way of trying to exclude people who you suspected were prostitutes, for example, or had questionable gender preferences. That's how they put it. So is that what moral turpitude means? But that's how they interpret it. And you have all these letters in the archives where they say, should I exclude this person? Should I not? I'll tell you my favorite letter. There's this guy along the border who writes to Washington, D.C., and he's very honest, and he says, I can't tell a Chinese immigrant, a Mexican immigrant, and an Italian immigrant apart. Send me guidelines. He's desperate. And I think it's a really good way of thinking about how, even though we think that race is fixed and predetermined, it wasn't. This is a period where a lot of immigrants from certain parts of the world went to court to claim that they were white, so Syrians, for example. Some immigrants from India. And so it's because even though we think that it's fixed and we've got it all figured out today, that was actually not the case. And the courts could not agree, and the laws could not agree either on who was supposed to be excluded. And then I've mentioned the literacy test, political beliefs, right? World War I is perfect for that, right? Because if you're a radical of any kind, you can no longer come into the country. And then the criminal record, right? So until 1921, this is kind of the compromise between restrictionists and critics of restriction. It's like, okay, can we recognize that we have to control immigration somehow? Sure. But can we just focus on the quality of immigrants that we come in? And until 1921, things seem to be okay, except that those Eastern and Southern Europeans, they just keep coming in. So, and the war adds to that. It's like they are going to be poor, right? And they come from destroyed countries. So the literacy test will no longer be enough, in part because they talked about the literacy test for so long that people were actually getting an education, right, as a response. So by the time you get to, I really do, I'm very conscious because I want to hear your questions. So I'm going to try to wrap it up fairly quickly here. But so what happens in 1924? There is a consensus that qualitative restriction is no longer enough. And there is a shift to quantitative, right? So now we need numbers. I want to say, and I can say a little bit more about this later if you'd like. Ironically for us, especially as a historian, 1924 was the compromise measure because there were proposals on the table that were a lot harsher, like suspend immigration for 10 years. Or deport them. So those were seen, things that we often talk about today, right, as potential solutions, were seen too extreme at a time when the anti-immigrant sentiment was pretty intense, right? And so what's the compromise? That except for Filipinos who are now in American territory, all other immigrants are banned from the United States. And they cannot become American citizens if they manage. Because I said there's a small group that can come in still, right? That provision on citizenship, right? The fact that, so they justified it not by race. They said, if you can't become citizen, you should not be allowed to come in. It's a really interesting logic. The connection between race and your ability to become a U.S. citizen will not disappear until 1952. So now a huge chunk of the world, right, can no longer come in. So what happens to immigrants from Europe? That's what they think about when they say Eastern Hemisphere. They impose what they call the national origins quotas. So each country in Europe gets an annual number. We're not going to do math today, I promise. But the number, which is supposed to be objective, is calculated in a way where Italy gets really small numbers, as does Greece and Poland and Russia. And if you had to guess, which countries get a really big number every year? Germany, Ireland, the Scandinavian countries, right? So the message is I promise I'm not doing math with you. It's a really complex, even people at the time, it's like, what are we doing? And the issue was, we cannot explicitly say, we don't want you. Because one thing that happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act is that they kept going to court. Can you really exclude people because of race, right? And so 1924, it's like, rest assured, it's not about race. It's not about undesirable white immigrants. It's about the numbers. You see why quantitative was more persuasive? And I'll make one small aside, and then we'll go to the last point, which is really interesting, I think. The quota for Germany remained unfilled through the 1930s. There were plenty of people who applied. A lot of them were German Jews, right? And so there are other means, right, that these numbers were used to restrict immigration. But even the highest quotas, right? So the Irish quotas, the Scandinavian quotas, they were always filled, but mysteriously the German ones, which had the largest quotas of them all, never went filled to the 1930s. There is a problem, though. If we eliminate, right, if we really restrict the number of immigrants from Asia in Europe, who exactly is going to do those jobs that no one wants to do? Like, who's going to work in the fields? Who's going to keep taking care of railroads? Still a question, right? And so there's a compromise. Originally, those numbers by country were supposed to be global. And they would have included immigrants from the Americas. But it didn't, because Southwest lobbies from big agricultural firms decide, are you out of your mind? What are we? Who's gonna pick our food, right? And so, right, there's a sign of the contradiction here. There's the rhetoric and the really harsh immigration laws and the acknowledgement of the reality. However, there's yet another compromise. It's like, sure, but we still want the ability to not let them all in. And what if we no longer need them? Who's going to deport them? So 2 days later, Congress creates the Border Patrol. Right? So recognition of a problem and a solution to continue controlling how people move, how they come in, right? One of the things that happens with 1924, it kind of sends a message that people from the Americas, especially from Mexico, they will be, and I'm not trying to be funny, they'll be permanently temporary, right? So they're designed not to stay, They're thought of not to stay. So Henry Pratt Fairchild belonged to the Immigration Restriction League, and he was one of the biggest advocate for immigration restriction against Europeans. And he says, the national origins quota system guaranteed that the immigration stream correspond to the basic character of the American people before the onset of the new immigration, right? So let's go back to, right, what is it that upsets Americans so much? It was about religion, it was about culture, politics, right, and race. And so Fairchild says, this cannot be the United States. And then Johnson, never to be outdone, the United States is our land. If it was not the land of our fathers, at least it may be, and it should be, the land of our children. We intend to maintain it so. The day of unalloyed welcome to all peoples, the day of indiscriminate acceptance of all races, has definitely ended. Right? So hopefully now, if you go back to those first three things that we were going, hopefully now you know how we got here, right? There's a confluence of events that just happened, right? That they aligned to make it possible. So what's left to do, right? They were right. And a lot of people say that. It's like, I wish we had stopped a qualitative restriction because that was something that we could all agree on, right? But now there are quantitative restrictions as well, which affect everyone. So their fears at the end of the 19th century that they would be affected as well. So the people from their countries would be affected as well, that their integration into American society would be affected, were correct. And so the question now is, how do you pivot? Now that you have a law on the books that says you are unwelcome, you are undesirable, what do you do? And so the late 20s are really complicated because when you read these documents from the archive, the sense of loss, betrayal, right, and really uncertainty is felt really deeply across both the older immigrants, right, from Northern and Western Europe, and even more so among the new immigrants. And so they realize, right, that they have to find a way forward. So how do you challenge a law that is so explicitly telling you we don't want you? And they choose two things, which are still at the heart of American immigration today, even though they're both under attack, right? So they might change. Family reunion, because what happens with the quota system is like maybe mom or dad are here, but or not. Or they want to reunite with their parents, right? And so there's a really strong push to say, can't we at least allow immigrants to reunite with their families? Can we prioritize, if we don't like people with no skills, can we prioritize immigrants with skills? And they're actually quite effective because the next time immigration changes in 52 and then even in bigger ways in 65, that's what actually happens to the American immigration system. The largest number of quotas now are for family reunion and for people with skills, right? But that, I just want to emphasize this, that was a compromise too, right? Because it's not that the US doesn't need people, unskilled immigrants, right? We still see it today, someone said it in the audience. So they're successful, but that doesn't mean that everyone was on board. So I'm going to leave you with one more quote, which unfortunately is a little bit depressing. Sorry, I should have ended on a better note. So Fiorello LaGuardia, he works on, at this point he's not mayor in New York City yet. He actually works on Ellis Island, he spoke multiple languages, and so he worked as translator and was trying to help. And so he got tons of letters. So even for a principle, right, that is at the heart of American identity, which is family, this is what someone writes to him. I'm sorry for separated family, but they might reunite themselves in Europe from whence they came, if they so desired, right? And so even an argument that could have been easy, maybe digestible, and eventually, right, the whole country gets there by the 50s and 60s, did not go unopposed, right? And so I think it's always important to realize that in these conversations about where you stand, right? There's constantly negotiations and compromise, and they were plenty criticized in the 50s and 60s for not going further, for not pushing for the elimination of quotas. But this is the environment. I want to show you, right? This is what they have to deal with, right? And that's why the options are actually quite limited. Thank you. Sure. Any questions?
Is there a limit to the number we can ask?
So there are, right now, there are two numbers. One is by country and one is global, right? So there's a cap on how many immigrants can come every year total. And so if your country doesn't fill, is that what you're asking?
No, it was a poor question. I was asking, how many questions can I ask you?
Oh, no, please ask. I mean,
The picture that had the two guys with the shoes up to their knees that looked like they were inspecting the faces and the eyes of the line behind them. Do you know anything about that picture and anything about what group that was coming in and what they were literally doing in that picture?
yeah. Actually, oh my goodness, that's such a tough photo. Sorry. Thank you. Let me see if I can pull it up again.
The other question, not unconnected to that to me, is there seemed to be a lot of name changes when people came over. And sometimes they seemed to have input on that, and other times they went with a suggestion of who was allowing them in. And I wondered if you had anything to tell us about that.
Yeah, I have a lot of personal stories about that too. So we now know, normally, I think about until 10, 15 years ago, the answer to that question is that people were not good at transcribing their names, which I think happened, but it didn't happen as much as we think. What was happening, and the closer you get to 1924, the more that happens, is that immigrants come in and try to Americanize their last name in the hopes that it will help them. Right, and so it becomes, at first it was definitely an error, mistake. People didn't care, right? But then it actually becomes a strategy. And so I'm sorry if you have a hard time finding your ancestors, because that's what happened too. The first one, so, oh my goodness, and now I can't remember. I don't know the official term for pink eye, I'm really sorry. Yes, conjunctivitis. So it was one of the most common things that you could catch coming here on a boat steeped with a lot of people. But that was perhaps the most common reason why you were rejected. Even though we now know, and they knew then, that it's actually treatable. Right? So that's what they're checking here. And you have letters, I mean, that's a hook. It's a metal hook. So you can probably imagine how painful that was. And I didn't want to show you, but there's also, if you were pulled aside and you have a second level of inspection, you also had to be, and this happened to men more often, you had to be inspected completely naked. And you have letters sorry, this is really hard, from these 14, 15-year-olds who never been naked in front of anyone except for their parents. Right? And so it was really humiliating. And so and that happened because there's a really strong fear that people are hiding disabilities. like walking, for example, like if you have a leg that's shorter than the other and so on and so forth, right? Or what your genital organs looked like, right? Because that could make you deportable as well under the likely to become public charge. Remember that really capacious category.
One footnote about names in Minnesota is how many French people changed their names to disguise connections to indigenous people.
Right.
So particularly in the Red River Valley, you
Yeah.
have a few remnants of those French.
Yeah.
But all over Minnesota, those French names got anglicized.
Right, right.
Other questions?
Thank you.
I'm going to try and just...
I have a question of where does the development of a national identity fit into this development? So I mean,
Yeah.
that you know you see even today those countries that have a very strong nation state drive to homogeneity, like
Right.
China suppressing the Uyghurs or whatever.
Right.
That makes countries more restrictive. But
Yeah,
that's a
so-
long development. in the
Yeah, I
US.
didn't want to put it in those terms,
Yeah.
but the end of the 19th century, that's exactly what's happening. And the U.S. is not unique, except that the U.S. has a lot going on, right? It has immigration, it has the abolition of slavery, and it has these people from these territories, right, in the Caribbean and Asia. And so the idea, so one big thing that happens that's tied to national identity is that they start using the word immigrant rather than emigrant, right? So all of a sudden there is a border, right? And I'm not thinking of you about where you're coming from, but I'm thinking about you coming into my country. And so that rhetoric really starts at the end of the 19th century, and the answer keeps changing. At first, people are somewhat okay with the melting pot, but by 1924 they clearly are not. But that's also tied to building infrastructure. That's why in 1882 the first thing they do is they create an immigration bureau. So it also coincides with the federal government becoming much more visible and stronger at the end of the 19th century, because they want to define what it means to be American. And the law, in a way, that's what immigration laws are, right? By saying we don't want these people, you're saying that's what we want Americans to look like, right? We want them to be educated, we want them to be wealthy, we want them to be Protestant, we want them preferably to be from Northern Europe, right? And so those laws actually serve as part of constructing an American identity. Someone,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, before I ask my question, I just want to know, are there any immigrants from Norway here in the, I'm one, no. So that's,
Denmark.
Oh, yeah. So there's still, but my question is that the influence of one individual can do much to change the attitude of American people. And I'm thinking of the governor of Iowa that you mentioned in the use of English language.
Right.
And I'm just wondering now, when we have a presidential candidate who wants to get rid of all the immigrants, do you have any comment on that?
I will make one. And I don't think when they talk about immigration, they only think about undocumented immigrants. It's clear that they're shifting towards all immigrants. And that one of the things, so if you have time, I encourage you to read the 14th Amendment. It's beautiful. It's probably one of the best legal frameworks that the world has ever created. One of the things that the 14th Amendment does is that it gives citizenship to anyone who's born in the United States. But the other reason why it's beautiful, it's because it guarantees rights,
I'll be right back to you.
and they were very intentional, not to citizens, to people living in the United States, regardless of status, right?
Next.
So I think that's, they don't like that. I'll just leave it at that.
This is more a comment than a question, but the very period that you're talking about, 1924 and the years around then, was the very period when this organization, NAHA, was being formed. So these were the things that were in the minds of the people who created this organization. And what does NAHA do? NAHA is an organization to document the history of Norwegians in America, to demonstrate, in other words, that Norwegians have a history in America, and despite the fact that they are Americans, they are also, they have a separate identity as Norwegian Americans. So it's the debate that you're describing is very much the background that brought this organization into existence.
Yeah, so there are a lot of organizations that are born because they feel like they have to justify, right, their existence and their contributions. So it's called contributionist literature. So you have so many books that come out, and thank goodness, because otherwise, so one of the constant refrains is that immigrants committed more crimes, right? And these are the organizations that collected real hard data showing that that wasn't the case. And in fact, that immigrants, because they feel that they're not welcome, almost have to behave even better than native-born citizens because they know that they could get in trouble more easily, they could lose their... Because this is the period where the U.S. government also starts taking citizenship away from naturalized citizens. So the stakes are really high, right? And so that's why there is that impetus to say, and to the second part of what you were saying, is that it's actually okay to acknowledge this kind of transnational connection, right? But that piece will not become acceptable until the Cold War, when it's like, oh, please do write to your relatives and tell them to vote a certain way back in Europe, right? Don't tell them not to go communist, right? And so, but up until the Cold War, it was inconceivable that someone could have two connections, right? The people really talked about loyalty. It's like, you're disloyal if you do that. And even in academia, it took a long time to recognize that people are the products of two worlds. Right? You don't get to choose where you're born, right? And if you leave, we should recognize that those are tough things to do. Not everyone, right, wakes up in the morning, it's like, I want to leave my country, I want to learn another language, right? It's not easy, but oftentimes people don't have options, right? And even in academia, it took a while to recognize that these people actually can hold the two things at once, essentially. Thank you.
Well, maybe I shouldn't continue on this, but I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
But Odd touched on the elephant in the room and maybe the donkey in the room at this particular season. But I was wondering well, I don't exactly know how to state this, but in the 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Act, I mean, you had explicit racism. Now, what do we have today? Do we just have, I mean, we're supposed to be an open society, ideally, and colorblind and all of that. But don't we just have sub rosa, barely suppressed racism?
Not even very surprised.
Yeah, I was going to say. I didn't want to mention this, so I'll say it now. So thank you for the opportunity. 1924, I think, is unfortunately responsible for making some of the policy proposals today even being considered. Like family separation happens, we no longer call it outrageous, right? During COVID, the United States did stop all immigration, right? A proposal that was considered extreme in 1924. Right? And so that is a really tough legacy. And the rhetoric sometimes I'm a historian, right? I shouldn't talk about the present and I cannot talk about the future. But sometimes when I read these documents, like where is it? This one. If I didn't tell you the year, someone could have said this today. Right? And so it's not even that veiled anymore. right? Think about what's been said about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, right? And I think what I find, and maybe that's where NAHA at the time came in, right? You show that these people are in the country legally, right? That they're contributing, but it's an uphill battle. There's a survey that came out last week, I think, that says 1/3 of Americans consider immigration a problem. I'm giving you, they're using a stronger word than that. And the largest chunk identified as Republican, the second largest is independent, but the third one is Democrats, right? And so this is a rhetoric that's actually convincing people across the political spectrum. I mean, I'm a white, highly educated European, and I've experienced it. I've been in the United States for 20 years, and it's definitely gotten worse, especially during the pandemic. And so I think that what we're seeing is that as much people didn't like the politically correct, I really did not hear. I do not need to know that you hate immigrants. That blunt, the bluntness, the veil is gone completely, right? We've heard it, unfortunately. I think the challenge is how do we put it back? And
So let's take one more question.
yes.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question because 1924 is, okay, there it is. 1924 is an interesting date for Norwegian historians of emigration. And what's happened now is you have younger people who kind of heard the stories from their grandparents or great-grandparents about all these relatives in America. They don't know who they are. And so those of us that go over there and visit, you hear the historians say, we want to know more about why people left. But more importantly, we are tracking all of the people who returned. And in my family, there are people that went back. They came over, in the 20s. They went back in the 40s. And what's happening in Norway, they're looking at, well, why did these people go back? And I think, I don't know if you've been looking at that, but I think it's quite interesting in all of our families, the kinds of people who went back, and now they're, part of the richest country in the world. But
Right. So Italy, for example, has the highest return rate of all immigrant groups in the United States. About 60% of Italians returned to Italy, not necessarily because conditions were better, right? But another story that I could have told today is that these people had two options, right? They stayed and fought, or they left because they just could not deal with living. It's like, sure, I make more than where I come from, but at what cost? And so those numbers are actually, we need to know more of that story, but it's really interesting that a lot of those decisions track with some of these laws, right? Because you're faced with a decision, like, do you really want to stay in a country that hates you so much just to make more money, or should you go back and be poor, but at least feel like you belong, right? I mean, it's a really tough choice to make. But that also allows me, since it's the last one, we need to preserve the stories. Let's go back to the archives, right? And I worry a lot that archives, libraries, and the study of history and the humanities are under attack. There is a reason why. These stories make people uncomfortable. Right? We like tidy history where everything gets better and everyone is happy. But that's not what happens in practice, not in the US, not anywhere. And so I think this is why an organization like this has to continue that kind of advocacy too, because we risk losing really important stories and perspectives.
So Maddalena, thank you for coming from Italy. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not yielding to the pressure, but mostly thank you for this superb, excellent, thoughtful, provocative talk this morning. So I'm sure she'll take other questions during the break, but let's take coffee and come back at 10:30.